The Dothan Association of Women's Club, Man and Woman of the Year Hall of Fame. This was the 25th year that the citizens of Dothan have set aside to honor those who have given significantly of their time, resources, and most of all, themselves to improve our community. Here are the honorees. Mr. J.J. Humphrey and Mrs. Emma N. Walton, 1957. Dr. D.V. Jemison and Mrs. Gussie McMillan, 1958. Dr. W.R. Greenfield and Mrs. Helen Clark, 1959. Mr. John Glanton, Jr. and Mrs. Catherine Baker, 1960. Reverend James A. Smith and Mrs. Bertha Gibson, 1961. Mr. John Glanton, Sr. and Mrs. Maggie Pearson, 1962. Mr. Herman Gamble and Mrs. Lovine Lee, 1963. Mr. Marion Hawk and Mrs. Alveda Hawk, 1964. Mr. Eiley Yelverton and Mrs. Lucille Smith, 1965. Mr. Fitcher Warren and Mrs. Flora Mae Tyson, 1966. Mr. James Hall Jr. and Mrs. Lavutha Grant, 1967. Mr. M.C. Patton, Jr. and Mrs. Hattie Hall, 1968. Reverend E.D. Jones and Mrs. Ruth Berry, 1969. Mr. W. S. Hayes and Mrs. Robbie West, 1970. Mr. Willis Bryant and Mrs. Nettie Fisher, 1971. Mr. Glennie Wiggins and Mrs. Nina Jolie, 1972. Mr. A. L. Walton and Mrs. Peggy James, 1974. Mr. Earl Jones and Mrs. and Hayden, 1976. Reverend Rochester Johnson, Mrs. Mary Cruz, 1977. Mr. James Thomas and Mrs. Susie Dumas, 1978. Mr. Wallace Smith and Mrs. Queen Patton, 1979. Reverend W. F. Thompson and Mrs. Vivian Scott, 1980. Mr. George Williams and Mrs. Malia Smith, 1981. Mr. Samuel Pedway and Mrs. Jewel Jackson, 1982. The Wiregrass Black History Channel takes pride in honoring our leaders from yesterday and today for making a difference. Thank you for watching. And make sure you subscribe, it's free.